You're right, the book wasn't published last time I was here, and I was saying to everybody, I've written a book, it's about to be published, and they're like, aye, all right. So, you know, in typical Scottish style, you know, my pals were all like, well done.
Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome here to the closing event of this year's Edinburgh International Book Festival. Let me, first of all, say a big thank you to the sponsor of tonight's event, the Open University in Scotland. And thank you to all of you for joining us. I can't even begin to tell you how much I've been looking forward to tonight's event. So much so that when I had a wee COVID scare last night, I was terrified that I wasn't going to be able to make it, but all well and good. But I'm going to ask you to join with me before we get into the discussion in giving a massive, big cheer to welcome home to the country of his birth, the creator of Shuggie Bain, Booker Prize winner, Douglas Stewart.
Made me blush already.
This is your first ever live event in the UK.
That's right, and I can't think of anywhere that's more special than being back here in Edinburgh.
There is nowhere more special than Edinburgh International Book Festival. Until the next book festival I go to, but we'll cross that bridge later. Douglas, how long is it since you've been back home in Scotland?
Yeah, actually, I was home right before the pandemic. My family still all live on the south side of Glasgow. And so I was home for Christmas 2019.
And how does it feel? Because the last time you were here, Shuggie hadn't even been published.
That's right, yeah.
So the last time you're here, you haven't even published your debut novel. And then when you come back, you've won the Booker Prize, and I think you were telling me something like 30 other literary prizes for this book.
Yeah.
So you've changed since you were here, but you probably see some changes in Scotland as well over these past couple of difficult years.
Enormous changes, and it just feels so good to be home. In fact, you're right, the book wasn't published last time I was here, and I was saying to everybody, I've written a book, it's about to be published, and they're like, aye, all right. So, you know, in typical Scottish style, you know, my pals were all like, well done, you know, sort of. And so to win the Booker, I felt like, yes, come on.
The thing is, people in Glasgow are probably still saying, aye, all right.
Aye, all right, exactly.
But you must have had a fantastic reception since you've been back.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. And it's been really great to meet booksellers who've really championed the book, who have really taken this moment for Scottish literature and really sort of connected it with readers. But it's been best to meet the readers themselves, you know, being sort of stuck at home and being broadcasting all year. You know, I've been everywhere, but I've been nowhere. I haven't had a chance to actually talk to readers and just to connect with people and see how the book has touched them. And that's why you write. You write to connect, you write to communicate, you write to share stories. And so that's about the human interaction.
Before we get into talking a bit about Shuggie and talking about the book, just talk us through how it feels to win the Booker Prize. I was telling Douglas that when it was announced, I was in the hairdressers in one of these wee windows last year when you could actually get to go to the hairdressers, and I was watching it on Twitter, and my hairdresser and I did a wee dance when it was announced that Douglas had won the Booker. But how does it feel? You know, do you have any inkling in advance, or are you know, literally as surprised as anybody when the winner is read out?
Yeah, you have absolutely no inkling. And so in the run-up to it, I had actually tried to read all of the shortlist because I felt this might be one of the greatest moments of my literary career. And I wanted to be so present because none of us were especially present last year. And so I spent all of that time, and actually I'd lost 2 big awards earlier that week, so I'd done the thing where I sat in my suit, and I sort of nodded and smiled, and was just glad to be there. And they announced the booker, and my mind and my body went in different directions. Like my body just sat there and my mind left the building. And they couldn't ever tell you in advance because I would tell my sister and then everybody would know. So, that would be the end of that. So no, it's a surprise. I was as surprised as anybody and delighted.
It must take a little while or a long time for it to sink in afterwards.
It really does, and they whisk you away right away and put you in front of a press junket, and you start talking to people, but you're just not there. You're just so overwhelmed. And I'd dreamt of just publishing a book. For me, I had very humble goals with Shuggie Bain. I'd been working on the book for 10, 12 years, and we know it had been rejected so many times, but for me, I just wanted to share this story with people and get it out there, and so everything that's followed has been beyond my wildest dreams.
Wow. It is an extraordinary, exceptional novel, and clearly I'm not the only one who thinks that. Reading this novel, and I'm sure everybody here who's read it will agree, it makes you cry, it makes you laugh, it takes you into moments of deep despair, but also lifts you up into moments of real hope and optimism as well. And one of the things I'm interested to hear you talk about is, because it has been talked about a lot, is the extent to which this is an autobiographical novel versus Shuggie being a truly fictional character. So talk us through, where does Shuggie start and Douglas end and vice versa? How much of it is based on your life?
Yeah. Sometimes it can be hard to sort of pull those two things apart, I think. I do write from a place of personal experience. I grew up... I was raised on government benefits in the same way that Shuggie is. I was certainly queer in a place that was incredibly masculine at the time. And my mother suffered with alcoholism from my first memories up until I lost her when I was 16. So when I write about, let's call it poverty and addiction and queerness or otherness, I write about them from the inside, but I wouldn't want anyone to read the book and think that every single scene happened to me, because what actually happened when I was writing the book is I realized that there was some really big themes in it, and I didn't think from an 8-year-old or 9-year-old boy's point of view I could really get my fingers under it and really explain it, the complexity of it. And the cast of characters just rushed in. Lizzie wanted to tell you a story. Agnes's other children wanted to really show you what life was like for them, and so then it becomes a fiction. It becomes this sort of almost this tapestry of voices, and that was one of the joys of writing a working class story, actually, because there were so many people going through the same sort of thing at the time, and they wanted to really just explain to you Agnes and Shuggie and their love for them, and also the characters' failings. So it's a work of fiction.
I believe you. But it reads like, whether it's a work of fiction or a bit of autobiography and a bit of both, I guess, it reads like a novel you have carried with you for most of your life. And you talk about, the period of time over which you wrote it, the many attempts to get it published and having it rejected. Did you ever just feel like giving up and either giving up writing or going and writing something completely different?
Yeah, I would be lying if I said I didn't lose faith at times, and I didn't sort of know where I was going with this. But for me, writing the book was very much about personal expression. It was about the story, and having sort of felt that, I write a lot from a place of loss and grief. A lot of my motivation was to recreate a lot of the wonderful things and the troubling things about my own mother, and to set it on the page, and then to spend time with those characters. It was also a huge lesson in empathy for me, Nicola, because I could explain how things felt to me as a boy, how being bullied or not having enough food or not having enough at home felt. But I wanted to, writing the book was a chance for me to hear from other characters and think about, why would a mother or my mother sort of turn to addiction when she had 3 children who loved her very much? Why were people allowed to say homophobic things at the time, and society didn't challenge them on it? And I had to really sort of dive in deep to that. So really the book for me in a lot of ways was very cathartic to write, and that was the point of it, I think. It was really a personal journey, and men from the west coast of Scotland aren't really especially meant to talk about their feelings. We're not really meant to express ourselves. We can be very proud of that sometimes, but I had a lot of things I wanted to express, a lot of things I had to examine, and art, literature allowed me to do that.
What do you think your mum would make of it?
I think she would be incredibly proud. I think a lot of my motivation for writing, because Shuggie stands in a long literary tradition in Scottish literature of industrial upheaval, of poor suffering souls, but they're often framed from the point of view of heterosexual men or the working man. And my mother, really, truly, my mother felt incredibly overlooked or unheard. And it wasn't that she didn't have a voice. She was never voiceless. She could roar. You could hear my mother from miles away, but she just felt like nobody cared. And so I think she'd be incredibly proud. She would be proud of me no matter what happened. She was a mother, but this, she'd have bought tons of copies and been up and down the scheme and sort of handing them out. So.
Well, I didn't know her, but I think she'd be incredibly proud, and you've given her an incredibly powerful voice. I read the novel before the Booker long list was announced, and it was a novel I'd tweet a bit about books, as some of you might have seen, and every time I tweeted about a book, somebody would tweet me, have you read Shuggie Bain? Have you read Shuggie Bain? And it took me a wee while to pick it up, and then I read it, and I just was completely blown away by it. I thought it was absolutely exceptional. But then when the Booker long list was announced, I was thrilled and delighted to see it on there. But I must admit, I did wonder how far it would go through that process, because to me, I grew up in the west of Scotland, a bit older than Shuggie. I knew people like Shuggie. I knew people like Shuggie's mum, and we find Shuggie in the first few pages in Albert Drive and Pollock Shields.
That's right.
It's the constituency I now represent in the Scottish Parliament. So it felt very personally Scottish, and not even personally Scottish, very personally kind of west of Scotland. Yeah. And I wondered, would it translate? Would it be as relatable to people in other countries as it was to people, certainly those like me who'd grown up in the west of Scotland? Did that surprise you? And then I suppose what it means is that the themes in this book of, as you say, otherness, poverty, inequality, people without voices, they're universal.
Yeah, they're absolutely universal. I wrote it from a point of view of, first of all, making sure it was accessible to Shuggie and Agnes, because I felt that these weren't characters you heard from in literature very often, and nor do they turn to literature to understand the world. And so when I was writing the book, I didn't want to exclude them from the novel. I didn't want to pitch it beyond them. I didn't want to sort of make it something that they couldn't access. And I always found that people didn't really understand how I grew up in the world, or where I was from, or that. And so I wanted to make sure it was an incredibly immersive experience, which I think makes it very personally Scottish. I find a lot of dignity in details. Even when you're talking about ugly things, you can make them beautiful. There's always a tension there. And part of that comes from the Glaswegian spirit, I think, Nicola. I think we often have very opposing things close together. There can be violence and tenderness. Certainly in sad times, my family always turns to humor in order to cope with it. And that's life. And so I wanted to do that. But I think part of Shuggie's rejection, why a lot of people rejected it, is because they felt it was steeped in the details and steeped in the milieu. And what people, I think, underestimated at the beginning was that this is a human story. And so when I talk to a journalist, no matter where they're from, they say, wow, it was hard in Glasgow to be queer in the 80s. And I say, was it great where you are? And they were like, oh no, it was terrible. And I'm like, that's a universal story. This is what the world is. And so that's really been the power of it. I think many women have been able to really empathize or sympathize with Agnes and her story, because at the end of the day, she looks for very humble things. She wants to be loved. She wants a little bit of glamour. She wants the best for her children. She wants a home she can be proud of. And I think, a lot of people can really sort of understand that. And then whether you're queer or not, so many of us feel on the outside or othered by the communities we're in sometimes, or we don't just quite fit in. And people can really sort of relate to Shuggie in that way.
No, truly universal themes. You're going to do a reading now, and this is one of my favourite passages in the book. I'm not going to spoil it, but you talk there about Agnes and some of what characterises Agnes being so universal, not just in Scottish women, but in women everywhere. The real sense of pride and resilience, of overcoming adversity, putting a face on for the world. And, I think of so many people, some in my own family, people I knew growing up, that this passage really resonated with me. So over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is one of my favourite passages too. And so Agnes has obviously been spurned by her husband and been quite cruelly abandoned by him. But after a period of addiction, a period of sobriety, she actually is rebuilding herself, and she falls in love with a very upstanding man called Eugene. She is going on a date with him, and she asks Shuggie to teach her how to dance. She wants to feel current when she goes up the nightclub, I guess, up the dancing. But Shuggie's probably the wrong person to ask, because he teaches her the routine to Thriller. Which, if you send your mammy on the dance floor with that, there's problems. But here we meet them in their front room. The song changed, and Shuggie kept dancing. It was a self-conscious shimmy now. His hands burst open like fireworks, and his head flicked as if he had long, sexy hair. He dipped and popped, using his hips too much for a boy. He emoted along with the song like it was a grand opera and not a 3-bar pop factory hit for 13-year-old girls. Brilliant. What a smooth mover, she said. I'm going to do all this up the dancing next week. Eugene will just die. Just you wait. He was enjoying her attention, and something inside him flowered, and he started popping his body like he'd seen the black boys on telly do. The self-consciousness left him, and he spun and shimmied and shook in all the telly ways. He was mid-cat sleep when he let out a sharp scream. It was high-pitched and womanly, the same shriek he let loose when Leek leapt out of the dark at him. Shuggie stood, with fingers outstretched, frozen in time. He hadn't seen them at first, and he would never know how long they'd been there, but across the street, in the window of the front room, stood the McAvenis. They pressed against the large glass window, and they were gutting themselves with laughter. The window throbbed as they beat their hands against it with glee, and Dirty Mouse did a little sexy girlish pirouette, and Shuggie realized that was him. He looked at his mother. When had she noticed? She only looked up at him and took a draw on her fag. Without glancing out the window, she spoke through clenched teeth. If I were you, I would keep dancing. I can't. The tears were coming. You know they only win if you let them. I can't. His arms and fingers were still outstretched and frozen like a dead tree. Don't give them satisfaction. Mammy, help. I can't. Yes, you can. She was still smiling. Just hold your head up high and gie it laldy. She was no use at maths homework, and some days you could starve rather than get a hot meal from her, but Shuggie looked at her now and understood that this was where she excelled. Every day, with the makeup on and her hair done, she climbed out of her grave and held her head high. When she had disgraced herself with drink, she got up the next day, put on her best coat and faced the world. When her belly was empty and her wains were hungry, she did her hair and let the world think otherwise. It was hard at first to start moving again, to feel the music, to go to that other place in your head where you keep your confidence. It didn't go together, the shuffling feet and the jangly limbs, but like a slow train, it caught speed, and soon he was flying. He tried to tone down the big showy moves, the shaking hips, and the big sweeping arms, but it was in him, and as it poured out, he found he was helpless to stop it. Thank you.
That's so fantastic. It really is just a wonderful passage from a wonderful book. And it really, I suppose, just crystallizes at its heart. It's a love story. It's a love story, about the love between a mother and son overcoming adversity. And although, he was often the carer for her much more than she was for him, in those moments of real vulnerability for him, she was there lifting him up and encouraging him to be all he could be.
That's right, and Agnes, for me, her power, her real strength comes from her pride and her determination and her defiance. And like you said, I'd known so many women around me like that growing up, and I always admired that quality. And, you know, Agnes doesn't have the language to say, I see you to Shuggie, I see that you're young and you're queer. But she sees her son, I think. I think she truly will, you know, she knows him. She loves her son like mothers love their sons. And she's teaching him to have strength and to keep going and to be himself. And so that, for me, was a really powerful moment in the book. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a love story. I didn't set out, actually, and some people don't believe that, to write a political book or a book that looks at these big themes. I set out really to look at these two souls almost in isolation, or feeling almost like a Greek tragedy where they were stuck on these 4 streets and trying to do their best and trying to survive their loneliness and everything that was thrown at them. But I couldn't set a book in 1980s Glasgow and have it not touch on some quite murky, quite big political themes. But it is about love, and it's about all kinds of love. It's about Agnes's loss of love, it's about self-love, it's about Agnes's search for new love, about how all of her children love each other. It's about love.
Yeah, it truly is. But it does deal with some big, meaty, powerful themes as well. I mean, one of the things I think is really special about it is the way it challenges the stigma of addiction. Mm-hmm. You know, we still lose far too many people to drug and alcohol addiction, and there's lots of reasons for that we need to overcome. But at its heart, it's about the stigma, about, you know, people feeling they can't come forward for the help that they need, and this book really challenges that. You know, Agnes is not a bad person. She is, in many ways, a victim of her life circumstances, of the circumstances in the country that she was growing up in at the time she was growing up, but she's a good person who loves her children and battles as hard as she can, and, you know, falls foul to addiction. So it really challenges that stigma. I don't know whether that was deliberate or a theme you set out to address, but I think it does it really powerfully.
Yeah, I'd always actually felt incredibly lonely going through my mother's addiction even as a man. And as I spoke about, I felt like such waste there, Nicola. All I wanted was my mother back, right? She was gone too soon. She had so much potential as a person. She was bright, she was hardworking, she was beautiful, she was funny, she was generous. She was also lots of complicated things, as I wanted to portray with Agnes. But I wanted just to really create this very intimate domestic account, you know. Oftentimes when men suffer with addiction, they do it in public. They go to the pubs, the miners' club, you see them on the street. But when mothers suffer, it can be a very secret thing. It can be a very hidden thing for a long time. And so I wanted to really bring people into the world and to feel, you know, that loss and that grief and that love there, but also to sit with Agnes and to want to root for her too, you know, when she's sober and she's doing well, to feel like, come on, you can do it. But also sometimes you don't get the thing you want. You don't, you know, things might not get better. You hope they get better for everyone, but Agnes can't quite get there herself, and the battles for herself. And, you know, I wanted to really show that through the lens of her children and how far they go to save their mother before they have to save themselves in a way. But I realized in my adult life that even when friends had maybe had addiction at home, we didn't talk about it. We didn't share it. There's so much stigma there, especially when it's a mother, because we often blame women harder than we blame men when they suffer. I mean, you will know this, but, you know, I'm often asked, how could she do that? She's a mother. And I think to myself, actually, first she's a person. You know, first she's just an individual, and she's hurt, and she's stuck, and she's been jilted and spurned, and trauma's compounding. That's all before she's a mother. And I wanted to create as complex a portrait in that so people could have some empathy for the character at the beginning. And she doesn't always do the greatest things, but she's trying. Yeah.
And you absolutely root for her, that period in the book where she gets the job, she's with Eugene, you feel that there's some, you know, happiness, perhaps lasting happiness, and yet you know that's probably not going to be the case. But because I think the other theme here is the way in which, you know, poverty, addiction, it's often women and children who suffer disproportionately. And you're absolutely right. Women who get, you know, criticised and judged for addiction get doubly judged because somehow by being the way they are, they're offending what it means to be a woman and a mother as well. Whereas men, not all men obviously, but a lot of men take out the injustices they suffer through violence or, you know, compounding it for women. So again, that it comes out really well, and I don't think we traditionally have really focused on that and talked about it, but you bring that really well, I think, to the fore.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. It's true, and you know, I wanted also to show sometimes the burden that falls on children, because as you had said, the relationship between parent and child inverted or reverted, flipped very quickly. You know, and Shuggie and Leek and Catherine are incredibly watchful children. They're really looking out for their mother. And my own experience with addiction was, you know, you hope a child is loved and adored by everyone around them, and that the child doesn't know the rest of the world exists other than them. But sometimes as children of addiction, you realize that you're maybe not the most important person in the room, and so you have to care for the parent. And part of the burden that I found, part of the thing that the book helped me deal with was feelings of guilt I had. You know, as a young man with a parent that suffered with alcoholism, I always felt if I was brighter or funnier or better at school or quieter or made less mess or anything, then I could almost help my mother with her addiction, you know. And the truth is it was a battle that she waged, and I was only a child, but I never got to have those conversations with my mother, and so the book allows me to process an awful lot of that. But another thing I wanted to show that was important to me, I think, was to show that I also wasn't ever alone with that addiction. Although the characters are often lonely in the book, there was a very perverse comfort in the fact, sadly, that there was a lot of mothers having a tough time. There was a lot of men having a tough time. And what I wanted to show with the characters of Annie and Leanne is, even if you leave Shuggie at the end of the book, I want you to know Leanne Kelly's there, and Leanne Kelly's going through something. And there's a dozen, there's hundreds of these kids. It's really a tapestry of life. It's a milieu, and there was comfort in that. There was strength in that. It's also quite sad sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the most political of the political themes is the whole, the scarring of lives and communities through, the Thatcher years, deindustrialization, people just being thrown onto the scrap heap. And you read this and it's kind of social history. Right. I remember it growing up, but there's also lessons in here for the future. We're facing another big economic transformation as we address climate change and move away from old technology. So there's big lessons in here for us for how we do things in the future. So it's not just history. I think it's very, very current.
Yeah, I think so too. And, much of what I write about is answering a silence. And I had seen, a lot of literature sometimes celebrates the Thatcher years. People did very well. Some people did.
I don't read too much of that.
That's true. Good for you.
Actually, that's not true. I read all sorts.
Yeah. But, I felt an enormous amount of silence there. I knew the blight of unemployment as a young man. I saw what it did to good families on the housing schemes I grew up on. And I also felt the feeling that no one was coming to help. And I think, it was that sort of lack of hope or just lack of when is this going to get better that forced a lot of our parents into addiction, because, they had to escape. They had to find some way to numb what they were going through. And when I see this sort of reformation sometimes of Thatcher in the media, she's being lionized currently. We see a lot of a very strong, powerful woman. I want Shuggie to almost answer that and say, that's not the whole story. You can't consider a leader without also considering the actions on the people that rely on her or him. And so for me, I just wanted to show a very, you said that obviously this was a very difficult time for men, but when men struggle, it's women and children that suffer. And I made a very conscious decision in the book to not focus too much on the men and what they were going through. I didn't want to show picket lines or job lines, because I felt like the stories in the house were the ones we didn't hear enough of. And I wanted to do that with Shuggie and Leek, because so much of the politics in the book is actually incredibly personal. It happens a lot on the bodies of the characters, whether they're caring for each other, whether they're vulnerable or harmed, whether even Shuggie lets bad things happen to his body at the beginning of the book with the man in the bedsit. Agnes, he's learned it from his mother. Politics is incredibly personal sometimes. It happens here. And that's what I wanted to do with the book.
I think that is so powerful, because it's the hidden stories, the stories we don't often hear, but the ones that are real and affect so many people. And obviously, homophobia is another theme in the book. There's plenty of examples of that, and yet there is, I think, in that sense, a degree of hope and optimism. Shuggie is finding himself. He's learning to be who he is. Round about then, did you, was it just awful to be gay, queer at that time, or even then, and maybe it hasn't progressed as much as we like to think it has now, or maybe even regressing a little bit, but do you feel it's different? Did you feel there was change underway even back then?
I didn't feel the change myself. I didn't feel the hope sort of sweeping through. And I don't think this is a story specifically about Glasgow. I've learned this is a universal moment. But, as a young boy myself, and what I wanted to show with Shuggie is it's not about sex. It's not about sexuality. It's just about, why are you like that? Why don't you like kicking a ball? Why don't you like running and fighting? Why don't you like these other masculine things? And so it was the other children, as a young man, it was the other children that identified me in my otherness before I had any sense of what I liked and who I was. I was only about 6 or 7. And when that started to gain momentum, that was what I was my entire childhood. I won't use the slur words, but I was that, and I was reminded of it every day, and I had no sense of really who I was. But one of the things I wanted to show in the book is, it's a horrible word, but it's a horrible idea, but the power of homophobia is the hate it sows inside yourself. And a lot of my childhood was about trying to be different. If they hated me for reasons I didn't know, because I liked skipping rope or jumping elastics or My Little Pony or these things that boys aren't meant to like, if I just try a bit harder, if I try, then maybe I can change myself and fit in. And I use that energy for Shuggie, and you see Shuggie learning historic football scores like the rosary. They're so useless to him, but he's trying. And even the people who love him, who just want him to be safe and secure and find his place in this world that they know, try to, Leek tries to teach him to walk like a man, and he tramples circles of grass flat, just practicing and practicing and practicing. And one of the things I wanted to show in the book as well was the absolute isolation of that homophobia, because I personally was rejected so soundly by a lot of the kids around me and some of the men. I never took it home. I couldn't tell my family because I was so fearful that if I said to my mum or I said to my brother, this is what they're doing, they would be like, oh, you are like that. And suddenly I would lose their love too, Nicola, So Shuggie just goes through this really isolating time, and I wanted to use that device because Agnes is also isolated for her reasons, and I hope to intensify their love, the way they sort of clung to one another. But it was a lot of the book is about femininity in a masculine place and about how they're coping.
Yeah. Well, you've written I think an incredible book that I think for many of us, clearly not just in Scotland, we see a bit of the kind of childhood, youth that we had growing up. Not all of it, but you've reflected, I think, a reality for a lot of people, and you've created something truly, truly special.
Thank you.
But I guess winning the Booker Prize and lots of other prizes for your debut novel kind of creates a bit of pressure for what comes next.
Does it? Yes, it does. Yeah,
What
I'm
is
pretty
coming
anxious,
next?
yeah. Actually, what's coming next, I'm really excited. I mean, part of my personal history as a writer is I'm a textile designer by trade. That's what I did for most of my career, but I've been writing now for 15, 16 years and collecting a body of work. So I'm really happy to say that my next novel publishes next April. It is going to be called Young Mungo. And I'm very relieved to say I wrote it before I was even longlisted for the Booker. And so it comes from a very personal place. Hopefully, if it's a stinker, that's only my fault. I didn't feel the pressure of it. So, but it's a story about 2 young men. Writing Shuggie asked me a question. It asked me about Shuggie's sexuality. It asked me about what we did to young men, working class men, what we expect of them, how we hurt them, because we do. And I couldn't answer it in this book because this book is so firmly about Shuggie and Agnes. So I wanted to go away and look at 2 teenage boys growing up in 1991 in the East End of Glasgow, one of the most deprived neighbourhoods that I grew up in myself, and just sort of think about masculinity in that way. So these 2 boys are divided by territorial gangs, scheme gangs, but they fall in love across the divide. And the book is told in 2 separate parts, Nicola, where we look at Glasgow and the blossoming of their love, but then the protagonist is sent to the north of Scotland. He doesn't know where to make a man out of him. So he goes for some hunting and camping and fishing in the hopes of making a man out of him. But it's a trip that has disastrous consequences for everyone involved.
And you're going to give us a reading
I
from
am.
It, a world exclusive.
A world exclusive. Yeah, I'm a little nervous, so I haven't read from this, so if I stumble, please forgive me. But our protagonist, Mungo, has just gone to the Scottish Highlands. He doesn't quite know where he is, but as a boy growing up in the east end of Glasgow, he hasn't even seen the west end of Glasgow. And so this is a marvel to him, to see all this beauty. The sun was dipping behind the hills by the time they reached the loch side. After confines of the forest, the loch suddenly opened up and was almost too expansive for Mungo to take in. He stumbled down to the shoreline. The day was drawing in the last of her colours, and as the softest violets and apricots bled away into the horizon, he was sad to have not arrived sooner. Mungo tilted his head back and walked in a circle. The sky above him was a darkening blue, smeared with faint streaks of lemon. He hadn't known that the sky could hold so many hues, or he hadn't paid it any mind before. Did anyone in Glasgow look up? He let out a small, awe-filled sigh. All this beauty in the sky was mirrored in the loch as though Mother Nature was bragging. Gallowgate grinned with pride. Wait till you see the sky the night. You've never seen a black like it. Gallowgate offered Mungo his shoulders to sit upon, so Mungo could glimpse the other side before it vanished entirely in the dusk. From this height, Mungo thought the loch must be 2 miles wide and 100 miles long. On the far side, it was hemmed in by stilt hills, whose slopes were split like the underlying rock had torn through the very fabric of them. All the colours were patchy and mottled. It seemed to Mungo as though the hillsides had been blanketed in some giant threadbare rug. The moss green and drab brown were rubbed away in patches to reveal the grey granite as if it were the underlay of the land. There were scatterings of purple moorflower and golden gorse, and here and there were little pockets of white snow clinging stubbornly to the deepest fissures. The loch diminished out of view on the left, and to the right it turned around a lazy corner and disappeared behind a wall of pine trees. Mungo thought how it was 10 times bigger than his scheme, bigger perhaps than Glasgow herself. He had seen the sea twice before. There the water was always shaking and churning, but here the tide was lazy and the surface was glassy as a puddle. Nothing moved except for the buzz of black midges that swarmed low and excited a ripple of hungry fish. The loch looked colder and deeper than he could say. It looked sad, like it had forgotten, like it had been forgotten, quiet, like it kept its secrets. Gallowgate lowered the boy. He rubbed his hands over Mungo's cold back and then hurried across the broken rocks that lined the shore. Tucked into a moss-covered slope was a pile of rough-hewn boulders that vaguely resembled a bothy. There were parallel walls, and Mungo could still make out the crumbled doorway in a gabled far end. Outside the bothy was a fire pit and a semicircle of large boulders for sitting on. Thick, biting midges thrummed in the shadows. "You'll get used to them," said Gallowgate, handing the boy a large dock leaf. "Rub your legs with this and you'll be all right." Mungo rubbed at his bare legs and turned green and slick with chlorophyll. The biting flies seemed undeterred. St. Christopher hobbled out of the tree line. He plonked himself down by the loch side and dunked his feet in the icy water. With his angular bones and his grey tweeds, he was just another rock on the shoreline. Gallowgate marshalled the setup of camp around the stone fire ring. He took off his trendy nylon bomber, and the knees of his Italian denims were soon damp as he unpacked the pile of plastic bags. From the backpack, he unfurled 2 thin-looking tents. The 2-man tent he erected inside the abandoned bothy. The smaller tent he staked across the far side of the camp on a bed of dry shingle, almost as far away from the other as possible. Mungo helped drive the carved metal pegs into the ground with a flinty rock. "Shouldn't the tents be closer together?" Gallowgate looked at the boy and shook his head. It seemed he meant it to be a friendly smile, but it was without warmth, and Mungo thought he saw a flash of menace cross his thin lips. Perhaps, like Hamish, he didn't like for his authority to be questioned. "No, better to be far frae the fire," Gallowgate said. He went back to pulling the guy line tight. He strummed it to check its tension. "Don't yous want to see the stars?" Thank you.
Whoa. Well, I don't know about you, but I feel hugely privileged to have heard that world exclusive of young Mungo, and I can't wait to read it. So I'll be going home to pre-order it later on, I think. We're about to go to questions from our worldwide online audience and from our audience here in person. But I think I read somewhere, you've lived in New York for how long?
For 20 years.
20 years. I read somewhere that you're always looking for your way home.
I am.
When are you going to come home?
Very soon. And so I think Shuggie was a way to bring myself home first, to reconnect with the city, and I'm just so excited. So my husband's sitting in the audience, and we had big conversations this week, but I'm going to be home really soon.
He's okay with that, yeah?
He's going to be okay with that. You're going to be talking to him directly after this.
Okay. Excellent. Well, we can't wait to welcome you home.
Thank you.
Permanently. Actually, you're the second winner, Scottish winner of the Booker Prize. Obviously,
That's
James
right.
Kelman won the Booker for How Late It Was, How Late. But we've got so many extraordinary writers and novelists, and yet only 2 Scottish writers have won the Booker Prize.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Do big literary prizes have to do more to promote diversity, or is that not their job? What's your theory on that?
Yeah, I don't think we can rely on literary prizes to take the heavy work of diversity. I think that has to start with publishing. And I think we're making progress there. I think it also starts with readers. I think it starts with readers seeking out experiences and writers and stories that maybe they're not super familiar with. But, you know, I was so thrilled when James won the award when I was a young man. You know, I was just a young Scotsman starting to discover myself in the world, and it meant a huge amount to me. And I also remember the backlash against it because he writes in, you know, in the Scots vernacular, in the dialect. And so I'm very pleased to see that the culture has moved on so much that I also write in a Scots vernacular, and I've seen that really in the language of Scots, and I've seen that really be well received. And actually, one of the strange things, which I think is a notice for everyone in publishing, is when I was in Sweden and in Denmark last week, they didn't want to read the translated version. They wanted to know the Scots language. They wanted to see, you know, how these characters talk and how they sort of live their lives. And I was really proud of that for all of us.
So you should be. Well, I'm sure there's lots of young Scottish writers out there taking great inspiration from your success. We're going to go to questions now, if the technology works. Technology doesn't work. Right. So I'm going to take a question from our online audience first, and then you can have a think here about who wants to be first to ask a question from here. So first question here is from Donna G. So hello, Donna G, if you're watching. Dougie, you helped me forgive my mother for being an alcoholic when I was a child. Have you heard from lots of other people who've had similar peace and forgiveness after reading the book?
I have, and I've really been touched by all those stories. Like I said, I think many of us sort of suffer in silence in a way, or go through that experience by ourselves. And I'm really glad that a book can connect a lot of us and make us just feel a little bit less lonely. I've also heard loads of stories about people overcoming addiction. And people from my own childhood that I maybe would have thought the future hadn't been bright for them, went on to really conquer their addiction and to live long lives and happy lives. And that made me really happy. You know, that was some of the greatest stories. So, yes.
Excellent. We've got a question from the gentleman up towards the back.
Douglas, it's great to have you here in Edinburgh, and I've loved following your success and your progress, as well as reading Shuggie Bain. Going back to your point there about language in the Scots vernacular, given your international success, I've loved watching all the covers of international publications. How have the Japanese coped with like Giat Laude, etc.?
I get messages every day about what does run the messages mean. And I spend an enormous amount of my writing life explaining that to people. And it starts with, so she has letters? And I'm like, no, she has no letters in her bag. And then she's running? And I'm like, she's 75, she's not running. You know, nobody's running anywhere. And so it's just been it's been a delight. And also it's been, you know, no one reads your book as close as a translator. And it's helped me understand language more. And so it's been a fantastic learning curve for me. Thanks.
So going for the messages is more incomprehensible to an international audience than Gain It Loudy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Because running the messages seems like it should make sense, and it's describing exactly what it is. Gain It Loudy, they're just like, I have no idea.
But you get the sense of it.
Yeah, I love that when I say that to international audiences, and they're following you along, and then they're just like, sort of, they don't know what that is.
Right, we'll go for another online question. Claire G. Leek was such a powerful character for me. I would agree with that. I see so many like him in my line of work who don't have faith that they can achieve or belong. What inspired his character, and will we find out what happened to him? Did he ever pursue his art?
I don't know that we'll find out what happened to him. I'll answer the easy part first. But I believe in his strength, and I believe in how much love him and Shuggie have for each other. So I hope the future is bright. But Leek was inspired by several different things. There's a little bit of him inspired by my real brother, who was also always an artistic young man. But he's really inspired by the character of Jude Foley in Jude the Obscure. I was thinking about how this is a timeless struggle sometimes for working class men to, you know, to make it to university, to sort of ascend in their lives. Not that you have to, but Leek wants to. He has all the talent, he has all the ability. And yet he makes this huge sacrifice where he can't leave his mother and his brother. He sees he can't leave home. And he's my favorite character in the book because he makes this sacrifice and he doesn't tell anyone. You know, in a lot of ways, he's incredibly heroic in that way. And he just stays by his mother's side and his brother's side. But Leek is also a little bit of my own anxiety, actually, because, you know, I would never have left my mother's side. My life would have been very different. I didn't get to answer that question for myself. What would happen if my mother had survived? And so in a way, I was thinking about Leek in relation to myself and my own story. But he's my favorite character.
And right up the back.
Hello. I'm very interested in the fact that you have lived much of your life in my home country, and I've lived much of my life in yours. And you're talking about coming back. But how has that influenced both your ability to write this novel, because it's very much rooted in place and in the people of a place, and yet you've spent perhaps all your adult life in New York or in America. How has it influenced your writing, and how did it influence your preparation for the writing, the outlook, the different attitudes, etc.?
That's an excellent question, thank you. It actually influenced everything about my experience. First of all, I wrote from a real place of homesickness. Not only for a place, but also for a time. I realized Glasgow had changed so much, and I had sort of lost a lot of the people I loved and the place I loved, and also didn't live in that city at the time. But it also, so that longing kept me coming back to the project over 10 years and wanting just to be with the characters. Remember, I never thought this book would be published, so really it was me just making up voices in my head for most of it and talking to myself. But it also helped me realize, it made me feel really lonely because I realized that anybody I met that hadn't grown up in Glasgow around me didn't understand me. And it wasn't that they didn't understand my language, they just didn't understand the place and the time, and whether that was because we didn't have any money or whether that was addiction at home. Everyone just assumed that my childhood was very much like theirs, and it wasn't. And so that made me feel incredibly lonely, which made me want to clarify a lot of things. But also my experience as a migrant made me learn about sort of the clarity of communication. How do I take this Scots language and how do I talk about these characters that feel authentic to them, but also take people like my American husband along for the ride, you know, to make sure that he could understand what I was talking about when I talked about running the messages. And so it affected my experience. It also gave me clarity, I think, I hope, to look back and to see it sort of wider and broader. But, you know, a lot of these things you're not aware of when you're writing. It's just sort of feelings, and you only see it in hindsight.
I remember reading something you wrote, apologies if I'm getting it wrong, where you said that some of the hardships in your life were peculiarly Scottish in some way, but you also don't think you could have gone on to achieve what you've achieved without the safety net of Scotland. And so a lot of your success is down to growing up here.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of people think because I was orphaned at 16 and I went on and built this life that was bigger, that somehow I was self-made. I was never self-made, Nicola. I had always the support of the Scottish people. I had the support of an education system that gave me a world-class education, even though I was amongst the poorest of its citizens. And that's not true for people all around the world. And so I've always, you know, realized that I come from many people in a way, and I was always supported by that. I've always had really powerful, influential women in my life who've seen my potential, who've sometimes kept me very safe and sometimes encouraged me. And I actually met with my 2 high school art teachers in Glasgow. Haven't seen them in 28 years, and so we had a lot to talk about. But you know, they did a lot for me.
Yeah, I bet you they're dead proud of you. We'll go for another online question. Sabrina. Kazuo Ishiguro said that a book is best when it haunts you after reading. He spoke of the relationships of the characters and emotions in particular. Shuggie definitely does that, especially the passages that relate to him caring for his mother in her bad days, and these were very difficult to read. Which passages did you find most difficult to write?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually found a lot of them quite difficult to write, but nothing was more difficult than taking the innocence from Shuggie. There was some passages at the beginning of the book where he meets another boy and he goes around in the washing machine, and I felt, you know, that was just really hard, even though that was a fictional scene, because you don't like to sort of alter a child's dreams in that way, and so I found those really difficult. And then, of course, saying goodbye to Agnes it was always the hardest part to write, and I wanted it to be, you know, just this very intimate, everyday scene, but that was incredibly hard to write.
I can imagine that. And we've got a question in the front row here.
You've said in the course of the conversation that you never thought the book would be published, and I'm interested in that. Two things, did that give you a freedom to write a book, that you write the book in such a way that it was more honest and more free? And leading on from that, what can it teach us in Scotland about othering minorities and how to learn that minorities and different groups of people add to the tapestry of the beauty of the country?
Great question.
That's an excellent question, yeah. You know, it did give me a lot of courage, and I felt that I was only answering for Shuggie and Agnes in the book, that I didn't have a readership in mind, I didn't know who would read it, I hadn't ever thought that far ahead, and so I wrote the story that I really wanted to write. And in fact, it came with a lot of anxiety when the book publishes, because I suddenly think to myself, God, I should have thought about a readership, and is this what they might want to read? But it's far too late for that, and so, you know.
I think it worked out.
I think it worked out, okay, I think it worked out, but I was glad of that. I was glad, you know, so many things that we create in the world, we don't often get to create ourselves or in a personal space. And certainly working in fashion, I never got to make anything that was just for me. It was always about collaboration. So my writing was really only for me. But as I said earlier, you know, Shuggie stands in a long line of amazing, not that Shuggie's amazing, but there's amazing Scottish books that look at the suffering soul or look at these times of upheaval. You know, I'm a huge fan of Alexander Trocchi and James Kelman, Agnes Owens. But I'd never really seen the queer experience there. I'd never seen a single mother's experience done in that sort of industrial landscape. And so I wanted to just always say, we were always here. You know, sometimes you didn't see us, but we were always here. And that was important to me.
Great. Next question is an online one, and you've talked, and it's been quite striking actually hearing you talk about, or what I've taken from what you said is that for you, writing is, you know, therapy and comfort. It's how you express yourself, even if it is not something that's ever going to be read by somebody else. But what about reading? So this next question from Fiona. It's actually directed to both of us, but sorry, Fiona, I'm going to duck it and pass it entirely to Douglas, but I'm going to add a little bit to the end of it as well. So Fiona's question is, how much of a comfort was reading for you during the past 18 months in particular? Do you agree that books can help us get through the worst of times? So that's Fiona's questions. My addition is, what contemporary writers do you enjoy just now? Who would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think reading has been such a lifeline in the past year, just to make us all feel a little bit less lonely. And when I wasn't feeling super anxious, because I was anxious for a lot of the year, I think a lot of us were, it certainly sort of took me out of my own experience. I think certainly I could, it's not always healthy to be centered in your own experience. As for contemporary writers, there's so many that I adore. I think for me, one of my favorites of the past couple of years is Claire Keegan from Ireland. I absolutely love her work. I admire it so much because she does so much with economy and compression, and yet she tells these whole stories. I'm a huge fan of Graham Armstrong, Scotland's other West Coast boy, but I think the Young team did something very necessary and very honest, which I thought was phenomenal. Anthony Viesna's So's collection of short stories about being a queer Cambodian on the west coast of America is really fantastic. It's called After Parties. It's a really powerful book, and yeah, there's 3.
It's pretty eclectic.
Yeah, it's pretty, yeah.
The Young Team's a fantastic book, actually.
Oh, it's an amazing book.
It's a plug for that. Right, I think, I never finish these events on time, but given we've got an online audience, I probably have to, so we've got time for one last question from our in-person audience here.
So I loved both characters, Agnes and Shuggie, and I was really impressed at how you brought out the strengths as well as the weaknesses in both of them. And I wondered if you had thoughts about what makes people more resilient in adverse circumstances and why some people get drawn into addiction and what Scotland might do to reduce the risks of people being drawn into addiction.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I necessarily have a political answer for it because it's such a personal book. I think, we all deserve hope. We all deserve to feel like tomorrow will be better, no matter where we are today. And one of the things about the book that I'm always talking about is Shuggie is a hopeful book, but in literature, hope is often a very bright sunrise or a sunset. And sometimes it's just enough hope to get up tomorrow and think that it's going to be a little bit better. It's going to, I can keep going. And if Agnes's superpower is pride and strength and self-worth, Shuggie's is that sort of perpetual hope of children, They will take it as it comes. But, for me, the resilience is, I wanted to make a comment as well that sometimes people don't get to process what they went through. We don't get to discuss our traumas. Agnes, there's no conversation about mental health with Agnes's addiction because I never knew that at the time. It was just, sort yourself out. Why are you doing this? Get yourself on your feet. And so a lot of the things that happen to the characters in the book, they almost deal with and then keep coming back. They almost keep springing up. And I think there's an enormous, I wish it wasn't like that, but I think there's an enormous amount of strength there.
That's a pretty good place, unfortunately, to have to finish. That last question was fantastic. I mean, we've got so much more to do in Scotland, as I'm sure in many countries, to help people suffering addiction. But I think one of the truly special things that Shuggie Bain does is help us better understand addiction and humanises addiction. And I think that is one of the many really special things about the book and one of the reasons why your creation is so wonderful, so special, so powerful. And it's been a real privilege for us here tonight and watching online to hear you talk about it and have you join us for your first ever live UK event. Before I ask you to give Douglas Stewart a massive round of applause and wish you every success for young Mungo, which we're all really looking forward to reading, let me just, since this is the closing event of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, say a massive thank you to everybody who puts together this world-class, truly amazing festival. Every year that it is on, it's wonderful, but this year it's been produced in the most difficult of circumstances. And to Nick Barley and all of his team, thank you for making Scotland so proud. This book festival truly is one of Scotland's best exports, so thank you very much for all you do. But I'm going to round off. Douglas will be signing copies of Shuggie Bain after this event, so get queuing up to get the book if you don't already have it and get him to sign it. But please, let's round off this wonderful event this evening by saying a massive thank you, not just for being here with us this evening, but for giving us this masterpiece that is the Booker Prize-winning Shuggie Bain. Let's give it up for Douglas Stewart.